I want to talk a little bit about what my thought process is when I'm working with muscle. So that's what we have on the board through here. And this is, again, just like, well, you can see if it works for you. It's something that I'm working on developing at the moment, but this is, when I'm working with muscle, this is what's going on in my head. And this is how I try and take things down to their bare essence. The bare essence being what? Function and design. Those are the two things that interest us. So, so for any given muscle, right, this is the pattern that I would go through. First off, find the origin insertion point. That's technical data, right? That's something that if you can memorize it, amazing. But you can get it in 5 minutes on Google. So, or 5 seconds on Google. So, you know, that I'm not so interested in internalizing, but it relates to number 2, which is based off of the origin and the insertion, work out the function of it. This is integral to training yourself to think of the body as a machine. So something like this, right? The operation of a muscle is super simple. Has a point of origin, has a point of insertion. When it contracts, pulls a point of insertion towards a point of origin. That's it. Right? And in that process of contraction, it's going to get shorter and fatter. And that's as much as any muscle in the world has ever been able to do. Some muscles have multiple points of origin, multiple points of insertion. That allows them to do more things. But it's still a linear motion. And that's it. Doesn't matter whether it's quadruped, human, whatever. Everything is based off of that linear motion. There is a layer of complexity on top of that. So, for example, let's say I'm a muscle, and this is my point of origin, this is my point of insertion. When I contract, this anchor point stays where it is, and it pulls that towards that. Right? Every movement in the human body is done that way. What happens when this point is locked off? The opposite will happen, right? Because it's not like the muscle has any say in the matter. It just wants to contract. So if this doesn't move, the opposite happens. Right? An example of that would be my lats, right? My Latissimus Dorsi. So that's a muscle coming from the spine and the hips, let's say coming from the back, and going to the arm to here. So pulls that point to that point, so it does what? Pulls the arm down, right? Or like this. Okay, then what happens if the arm is locked off? Pulls the body towards the hands, does the opposite, right? So that would be, so yeah, you're doing a pull-up or something like that, that's your lats. Or if you're swimming, and you're doing something like that, that's your lats as well. So a muscle can do the opposing action depending on what other muscles are doing, but it can never push, right? The whole construct, the whole mechanics of the body is just based off of this very, very simple linear motion, and that's really all we need to think about. But if you're working in Shot Sculpt or you're working in CFX or you're having to represent this in some way, especially like let's say it's with anatomy that you're not familiar with. You should be able to fake it based off of that knowledge, because you go, well, what is the movement, and so then roughly where would the muscle mass be, and you should be able to guess this. Like this thing that I drew for the previous class. Let's just draw that again, so it's clear. So this is a rib cage. That's a pelvis. So if I talk about, well, let's put the spine in there. If I talk about a posterior chain, like does that mean anything to anyone? Or an anterior chain? Right, we would through your wife, right? So like the posterior chain is going to be, and so like yeah, people working with actual bodies, actual function are very, very aware of this. The posterior chain is going to be all of the muscles running down the back of the body, right? That since they're on the back of the body, they can only pull the body back. So just with this one bit of knowledge to go, all right, well, any muscle that's on the back of the body is going to be involved in pulling the body back in some way, right? So like, let's say the whole of the posterior chain contracts at one go, right? Because we'd have muscles here that are part of the posterior chain, muscles here, muscles in the legs, or whatever. What's going to happen is that basically that's going to get tilted that way, that's going to get pulled that way. So this is going to form a C shape, right? Like this, or if I carry on the posterior chain into the legs, it's that. So purely just based off of that knowledge, you know any muscle on the back is going to be involved in that motion. Or if you're looking at it in the opposite way, right, you're trying to dissect what muscles are being used in motion, you just go, well, is it a muscle that is related to the posterior chain? That is to say, or is the action related to it? That is to say, if I do that, right, maybe you know that's my hamstrings doing that. That's great. But if you don't, you should be able to work it out, right? Because this muscle is part of that, or this movement, sorry, is part of that that backward C shape. So go, okay, well, it has to be part of the posterior chain. And then you'd go, well, to move this, if I wanted to pull this back, where would I tie the strings? It would have to be somewhere above the joint and somewhere below the joint. And then when they contract, it does that. So that would give you at least the rough placement of the hamstrings that are actually doing the movement. So in this way, with this knowledge, you can fake it. And honestly, like, even though I am familiar with all of the anatomy, it's fun to fake it anyway. You know, I do it all the time. Like you know, if we wanted to sell this idea of all the stuff that's happening in there, well, this is layers of muscle, right? It's not really going to help you to figure out all of the stuff that's going on there. But you can go, well, all these muscles originate here, and they insert either into the wrist or the hand or the fingers. They're in some way involved in that motion. So that means that as soon as you have that action, just having some tendon popping becomes really important. And like we said before, having those wrinkles will be important because that'll tell you the compression. You hit those 2 beats in like 2 brush strokes and you're done. You know, you don't need to go and find like, well, that's the flexor carpi radialis and then the palmaris longus and flexor carpi ulnaris or whatever. It's not useful, you know. So coming back to this idea, you know, we can look at the front of the body and go, okay, well, any muscle running down the front is going to be part of an anterior chain, so that's going to curve you in the opposite direction, right? That's going to be that. And you could look at muscles down the side, that would be a lateral chain. That's just the basics of body mechanics. Super simple, really. There's one nuance worth mentioning here, which is like, how do you turn form through linear motion? Right? If you want to be able to spin a thing round like this, but the only action you can do is linear, how would you do that?
Using several layers.
Yeah, you could do that. You could have like one muscle pulls a bit, and then another muscle underneath that pulls a bit, and another one. And I think I would say there's an element of that happening with the layers that we have here: external obliques, internal obliques, and things. But an easier rule or a more direct rule is like you curve around the form, right? So it's like, so here, if I'm a muscle and I want to pull this point towards me, I have my point of origin here, point of insertion there, I do that. If I put the point of insertion around the back and pull it, as long as other muscles are holding this in place, it's going to spin that around. So any muscle that curves around form is a muscle that turns form. And you'll see that 1,000 times in the body. The obliques wrapping from the front to the back, so they turn. Sartorius wrapping around the inside of the leg there, so it turns. A repeating pattern that we see consistently. That's the only nuance, I think. Well, okay, there's another thing. There's what happens when both of those points are locked out. Right, so we've said that as a muscle, I want to do that. If that point is locked out, the opposite will happen. What happens if both of those are locked out?
Tension.
Just static tension, right? You'd see this in the changing rooms at the gym, like all the time, right? Just no actual movement, just tension, right? But it's I think, a relevant thing for us to think about. A good example might be this muscle here, the brachioradialis, which it's starting above the joint, starting above the elbow joint, finishes below it, so pulls that point to that point. It's doing that, right? It's helping the biceps. But if I don't allow that movement, so I can't do that, it can't do the opposite, so there, you see it straightens up. And that's a small detail really, but can be a bit of a revelation sometimes, because we generally tend to think about muscles as bulging. That's a word that we use a lot of time with muscles, but it's more like they want to be straight. So of course, like if they compress, they will preserve volume and bulge, but it's an electric impulse that's going through them that's straightening them up. And so that's what's happening there. So it's not bulging, it's a redistribution of the same mass. So that's static tension or isometric tension. And that's it. That's like any of the movement in my face, in my body, in my breathing, all of that stuff is coming from this very, very simple set of rules.